Hey everybody, welcome back to this video series that I've been working on, covering the backlash to The Last Jedi on YouTube. Last time we looked at a video by Shadiversity, and while we looked at a few of his main points, we did leave a few things out, such as his thoughts about Luke Skywalker. In addition to looking at general critiques of The Last Jedi on YouTube, we'll also be looking at videos concerned more narrowly with specific scenes or elements of the film. In the future, we'll be looking at reactions to fight choreography, battle tactics, and technology, but today our focus is the characterization of Luke Skywalker specifically. However, the thesis of these videos, which we will approach as a revelation in due time, is not a matter of reflecting on the work of any one creator. This is a video series about the general phenomenon of videos about The Last Jedi and what went down. As such, we will explore as many aspects of the backlash as necessary to get a decent picture of what occurred, and this will mean looking at the work of a number of prominent creators. This one was a hard one for me personally because, cards on the table, I genuinely have a bias against this man's accent. I'm not in love with English or Australian accents specifically, although they aren't all that bad, but wherever in Scotland the critical drinker is from has to answer for how awful this guy sounds. I wondered for a bit whether he sounds like this because he's actually drunk in his videos, but speaking with zero offense intended to Scotland, I genuinely could not tell you whether any of you over there are drunk at any point in time just by your voices. It's completely impenetrable to me, so I'm going to assume the critical drinker's demeanor is as sober as his analysis and move on. One of the critical drinker's earlier videos about The Last Jedi was called The Last Jedi and the Assassination of Luke Skywalker. And it really comes off like an earlier prototype for everything that he seems to say these days every time he sees any movie. Here's him weighing in on what he thinks about one of the faults with The Last Jedi.
But it also manages to utterly destroy one of the greatest characters of all time, a man who inspired entire generations of kids and adults alike, whose very name has become an integral part of modern pop culture.
It's a trap!
No! I'm talking about Luke Skywalker. Remember him? The guy who blew up the Death Star? The guy who went from an idealistic farm boy to a veteran Jedi over the course of 3 epic movies? The guy who stood up to Emperor Palpatine, turned Darth Vader to the light and saved the entire galaxy? The sheer depth of Luke's betrayal by The Last Jedi is simultaneously breathtaking and heartbreaking. If someone had told me a year ago what his story arc would be in this movie, I genuinely would have told them to get fucked because they were clearly talking bullshit. But what the hell, I guess time makes fools of us all. This film basically destroys everything that made Luke the iconic hero we all knew and loved. His very essence has been wiped away, the core of his being crushed and demolished, the fire of his accomplishments and struggles and triumphs brutally extinguished.
He goes on like this for a while, but you get the idea. A few things jump out at me immediately upon viewing this video. First, I think the critical drinker lays his aggrieved fan tonality on a little thick. He sounds wounded, like he's caught in a bear trap that Rian Johnson personally laid out inside a poorly lit theater, and he's pouring his heart out in the hopes that we can rescue him. Like I said, you can sort of hear the prototype for his later videos in this, but at least he's seemingly developed a better sense of scope and scale. If you're going to adopt that kind of attitude, you'd have a better argument to most people's eyes if you were tying it back to some real-world harm as opposed to whining about fictional characters being assassinated, which luckily the critical drinker appears to have noticed since that's all he does these days. New movie comes out, a man isn't treated like the second coming of Christ or is depicted as having real problems internal to his character, and that's Hollywood's anti-male agenda for you. That's how they usually go, and it's really tiresome. We've looked at that type of rhetoric before, but I suppose it's just always going to have a place on this platform among the dull and ill-informed. You can debunk that type of MRA, MGTOW, and anti-SJW nonsense ad nauseum, and that in itself won't necessarily get you anywhere. For anyone wondering why, back in the days of BuzzFeed pop feminism, annoying internet feminists used to behave as if all of the stuff that these types of guys fixated on with their platforms wasn't even worth addressing, or was a conversation that was already over, that's because academically that's mostly true. Obviously, sociologists and critics are always developing these discussions further, but the critical drinker isn't much of a critic. Not every YouTuber needs to be Adorno, but they could start by advancing a particular critique of a particular film or artist or what have you, with a certain idea or framework in mind, and with an attentiveness to the facts. The critical drinker has instead opted to do a lazier version of Anita Sarkeesian's Tropes vs. Women series, but with fewer citations and less cohesion. More to the point, the drinker appears to approach Luke Skywalker specifically as if Luke was a real person who had been slandered unrightfully, and not a fictional character for whom the film, as a text, is the presiding authority in terms of his characterization. There's a weird fusion of what I assume is empathy for the character, his struggles, his trials, his sacrifices, on display here, along with an absence of self-awareness. The drinker talks about Luke like Luke's struggle towards power and perfection is what made him who he is, but if anything, Luke is at his best in The Return of the Jedi when he's not acting, refusing to fight Vader or refusing to join the Emperor. From there, Luke mostly suffers, and it's actually Vader who steps in. Luke's choice is critical to his role as a Jedi, and what's interesting about that is there's not a secret scene at the end of Return of the Jedi where he looks into the camera and says, "Now I'm perfect and have no flaws, nor will I for the rest of my life commit a single moral trespass or injure another soul unrighteously." It's not just that George Lucas doesn't direct that kind of film when doing Star Wars. It's also that way because it would frankly be very silly and naive to assume that becoming a true Jedi by being tempted by, comprehending, and subsequently rejecting the dark side would be the end of Luke's personhood in his universe. Luke isn't perfect, but for us as the audience, the situation at the end of Episode 6 scans as all his troubles being over because it's the resolution of the plot and the conflicts of the film. But a new Star Wars trilogy brings with it new conflicts. You can say what you want about that Shadiversity video to which we responded previously in this series. You can say it was all over the place, it didn't make a ton of sense internally, and was predicated hugely on Shad's weird and unnecessary imposed biases, but it's honest, specifically in the way that it identifies a lot of the problems of The Last Jedi as beginning in The Force Awakens. I think a lot of these guys just really wish that they got in on the previous trend with Davis Arini and all those twerps.
Who is the white male audience supposed to identify with? Simple. The little white cockball.
Just when I think I'm not going to name drop H-Bomber Guy in any more videos, I do it again. I can't be stopped. I have a real problem. I also love this clip. I've muttered the phrase, "the little white cuckball," under my breath every now and again when it pops into my head, and it never fails to make me smile. It's not really fair to the critical drinker to put him in exactly the same category as stuff like this. I mean, he is one generation down the line in terms of the mutation of this exact behavior, but his essay does say other things too.
The fact they were able to get away with this is utterly baffling. It's a testament to how far this series has fallen, how little regard it has for honouring its own legacy, and how much it's prepared to sacrifice to shove its ridiculous politics down our throats. Before I really get into this, I want to get one thing straight. I'm not against the idea of a movie evolving its characters to reflect the passage of time or different circumstances. Taking a legacy character or a series in new and interesting directions can reinvigorate tired old tropes and cliches, breathing fresh life into something that's grown stale and predictable. That can all be great if it's well thought out and intelligently implemented. But like Thanos says, there has to be balance. In this case, there has to be a balance between the unexpected and the downright unbelievable, and this is where The Last Jedi starts to go off the rails.
I felt obligated to play this clip in particular for a couple of reasons. The first is that the drinker admits sometimes that change can be good, and it would be a little dishonest if I painted him as being exclusively opposed to changing the character of Luke Skywalker in any way whatsoever. So this is an easy acknowledgement of the nuance in his videos about that. I try not to be too absolutist in how I describe the personal views of the people I critique here, and this is a great way of reminding you guys that the people I disagree with in these essays aren't robots, they're real people with feelings. Remember the human, and all that. The second reason I wanted to play this clip, and this is just a brief aside, is that it felt really weird listening to the drinker going for the Thanos comparison, when the Force and the Chosen One prophecy from Star Wars is right there on the table. I guess maybe it was more timely when his video came out, but even so, I would have thought the Anakin and the Chosen One prophecy would be the easier rhetorical comparison, given that this is a video about Star Wars. The third and most important reason for reviewing this clip is that it seemed to me to be the beginning of the revelations of what the drinker's real problem with this film and its depiction of Luke is in reality. He states that Star Wars has fallen, it no longer honors its legacy, and much of this was done with the aim of forwarding ridiculous political messaging. Now, off the top of my head, going into this, I racked my brain to see if I could find out exactly what the critical drinker might be talking about. What political messaging was there in The Last Jedi? Well, the opening thesis of the film, as the rebels flee from the First Order and leave their equipment behind, is that people, leaders, and heroes are more important than equipment, starships, and individual victories. And this is affirmed by Rose when she saves Finn from his self-sacrificial maneuver at the end of the film. Over the course of the film, there's a tension between cynicism and principled belief, where the protagonists are presented with challenges to the idea that their cause is one of justice or is in any way remarkable. The internal challenges of multiple of our characters, namely Rey and Luke, are to see the best in others and learn from their mistakes. And this is complicated by the fact that Rey upholds Luke's trust while Kylo betrays Rey's, eventually resolving in Luke sacrificing himself to stall Kylo while apologizing to him. Whereupon, Rey leaves Kylo behind. Rey specifically is challenged to look past where she came from, like in the cave underneath the island, and look instead to what she is able to choose right now, like with Kylo tempting her to the dark side. Poe is challenged to put his faith in others even when he doesn't understand their intentions when it comes to Admiral Holdo, and Rose challenges Finn to see the underbelly of the Resistance in the First Order conflict in terms of how it affects the weak and the vulnerable on Cantobite. The film ends on a reconciliation of an admittance of failure, both the failures of the Jedi and the failures of Luke personally, and a desire to look forward as the spark of a new rebellion without disregarding an honest and complete view of the past and a willingness to confront the present, as exemplified by Rey keeping the Jedi texts and Luke facing off against Kylo where he says, "I will not be the last Jedi." Multiple characters have their arcs with similar thematic beats, and overall the story seems to resolve in anticipation of the final film in the trilogy. In general, we're given a sense that empire, revivalist dictatorship, war profiteering, slavery, selfishness, hasty judgment, misplaced trust, a desire to seek affirmation in the wrong places, and a refusal to acknowledge the mistakes of the past are all bad things. I can see how the drinker would interpret a lot of that as political, at least in a certain context, but why is any of it ridiculous? If anything, the politics of the film appear relatively straightforward. Maybe we'll get back to that later. Let's look at some of the drinker's specific gripes.
Anyway, he accepts the weapon and shaking hands, his expression torn between wonder and disbelief at being reunited with such a significant artifact from his past, and for one brief moment it really feels like we're witnessing something poignant and epic, the kind of iconic moment we've been waiting 30 years to see. Luke taking up the mantle of Jedi Master once again, accepting the responsibility of his past, finally living up to his legacy and being the man he was always meant to become. Are you fucking kidding me? Get used to this kind of bullshit, by the way, because it pretty much sets the tone for this movie's entire treatment of Luke for the next 2 hours.
I have to stop here again already, because there's so much to talk about. For starters, this is a great example of the kind of empathetic switch or emotional transposition that a few of these critics have had when making their film commentaries on YouTube. This is pretty early in this video series, but I'd like to coin our first term for this series, since I'm not aware of any existing terminology for this error in reasoning when it comes to film critique. I'm going to start by invoking what I'll call extra-diegetic empathetic displacement. I've chosen this term to begin to explore the critical drinker's error in thinking in this passage for a few reasons. Allow me to explain the analogy. The term extra-diegetic refers to the level of a narrative within the narrative but outside regular diegesis. Diegesis is a Greek term in narrative design originally meant to be contrasted with mimesis, where mimesis is essentially portrayal by showing or acting, and diegesis is essentially portrayal by telling or narration. In the medium of video games specifically, and this is the context upon which my phrasing specifically draws, diegesis here refers to the general storytelling occurring on screen in the in-game world, and those extra-diegetic elements are the ones outside the game narrative but within the game, like damage numbers or a health and stamina bar in a heads-up display. In psychology, as many of you are likely also aware, empathy refers to one's own ability to identify with the mental state, emotions, and motivations of another person, real or fictional, while displacement refers to the phenomenon of pushing what is usually a negative emotion onto a more socially acceptable or available recipient. If your character in a video game gets hit, you might empathize with your character's pain in the Ludo narrative, and you might furthermore assign that sense of pain to the presence of elements of your health bar being subtracted, or damage numbers appearing over your character. Game designers help this along with animations and dangerous-looking red flashes and numbers. In this case, because we're talking about the film and narrative more generally, we're dealing not with extra-diegetic empathetic displacement, but with extra-narrative empathetic displacement, where empathy with a fictional character in a fictional situation may require displacement from emotions felt towards a fictional character onto a real person. For example, if you see Poe struggling to understand Admiral Holdo's decision, you might empathize with his confusion and be angry with him. And if you hate the character of Jar Jar Binks, you might displace your negative feelings towards the character onto the actor. When these elements combine, a frustration with, say, Finn having his attempt at self-sacrifice complicated by Rose Tico's actions can translate into an empathetic frustration with the character of Rose Tico, which can translate into harassment towards Kelly Marie Tran, such as when alt-right Comicsgate loser Ethan Van Sciver filmed himself cutting up Rose Tico action figures like some sort of serial killer. I am, of course, not accusing the critical drinker of literally doing these things in this video, but citing them as examples of things I've seen other people do, for the purpose of making a larger point. I'm going to assume that even if the critical drinker is a pure grifter, who either doesn't enjoy any of the properties he talks about, or doesn't believe any of the things that he says, we are still at some point referring to real beliefs held by some of his audience. Extra-narrative empathetic displacement describes how those beliefs take root when the drinker explains how Luke was dishonored by being portrayed in a negative light in this wounded tone, as if he's personally been hurt by this, while what he's actually describing is the character of Luke being in an unenviable position, even as he redirects his frustrations to the makers of the film. When the drinker sees Luke tossing his lightsaber, he actually shows the cut to Rey's reaction, even as he reacts himself in an extremely negative and over-the-top way. I remember audiences in theaters having a similar reaction anecdotally. It's an odd moment, and it's almost certainly meant to make you stop and ask, wait, what? What's that all about? The drinker's confusion is Rey's confusion. He's having a response that is empathetically the response that the film is directing the audience to have, but he displaces that negative emotion onto the creators of the film, almost as if it were too big of a feeling for him to hold, or like it's a hot potato. It's this kind of, how dare you make me feel these feelings reaction, and even if he's hamming it up for YouTube ad revenue, it's still a real feeling that seems to have occurred among some audiences. You can see this in how he talks about Luke more generally, but we have some bigger problems in this video.
For example, when Luke learns that Rey has inherited the Millennium Falcon from Han Solo, he immediately realizes something's wrong and demands to know where Han is. That's pretty interesting, right? How will Luke react when he finds out his best friend has been murdered by his former apprentice? How will he cope? Will he lash out in anger, vow revenge, or retreat further into despair? Well, your guess is as good as mine, because the fucking scene immediately shifts to some other random bullshit going on at the other end of the galaxy, and the conversation's never revisited.
Okay, so, the critical drinker is being very dishonest here. To understand how, we need to think like a YouTuber for a moment. When the drinker wrote and recorded this section of his video, he then needed to put that audio file on a track in his video editor and add some B-roll footage. Naturally, he chose footage relevant to Luke in general. However, when he shows Luke's reaction to finding out Han is dead, he doesn't play the audio of the clip, so we wouldn't hear the pain and fear in Luke's voice, and he changes the transition of the film, so we get neither the audio nor visual elements of that choice by the filmmakers. What he does is play B-roll of Octo, which normally would be fine, except that it's essentially the drinker lying to you, because he glosses over the fact that the cut in the film is straight to Kylo, using the language of cinema to show rather than tell us what Rey tells Luke. It's an impactful way of using editing to imply what a less intelligent director would have just told you directly. The drinker says the film shifts to some random bullshit on the other side of the galaxy, but it's not random. It's visual storytelling using directorial technique. These guys and their rants about how Rian Johnson doesn't understand Star Wars would maybe be a little more sympathetic if they themselves didn't rely on their own ignorance of film as a medium. Additionally, the drinker doubly misleads his audience because when he cuts to Octo, he doesn't cut to Luke the next time we see him, and he never shows him on the Millennium Falcon mourning his friend by taking a moment of silence and reverie. So we do get to see how this loss affects Luke emotionally. In fact, the drinker never includes either that cut or the following scene on the Falcon. His B-roll suspiciously doesn't cut to Luke the next time we see him, where he's collapsed on the ground in grief and agony after learning about Han's death, meaning the makers of the film did in fact use the language of the medium to show the emotional response that the drinker insists was absent. You may know this as the scene where Luke calls his lightsaber a laser sword, as a way of mocking the misconception Rey had that once she told him everything he would answer the call. Instead, and make sure you're sitting down for this one, the hero first refuses the call. It's almost laughable how purposefully the critical drinker has to be in intentionally not understanding film in order to say some of the stuff that he says. The guy is just a liar. We see Luke react with shock, sadness, anger, and thoughtful silence over the course of the following scenes he's in.
The missed opportunities and shocking failures of basic storytelling are so numerous and obvious, it's almost physically painful to watch The Last Jedi.
I included this clip because I think it's the perfect encapsulation of how the drinker approaches film criticism. He acts stupid and ignorant, seemingly on purpose as his very persona, but unlike a kind of angry video game nerd style bit, it's not just a bit that he's putting on, he really is that guy. He then turns around and makes his own stupidity and ignorance everybody else's problem. He misleads his audience and refuses to understand the medium he's critiquing, and somehow that means everybody but him is missing opportunities or not understanding how to write a film. I don't think this video makes the point that he and his audience thought it made.
What we actually learn is that one night, Luke had a vision of Kylo Ren turning to the dark side of the Force. He went to confront him, decided it was best to murder him in his sleep, and drew his lightsaber, only to pussy out at the last moment. Kylo Ren then woke up, saw Luke standing over him, and used the Force to defend himself, knocking Luke out and going on a rampage. Are you fucking kidding me? This is the same man who risked his life to redeem Darth Vader. The same guy who refused the dark side and saved the entire galaxy. This man was willing to murder an adolescent boy just because he might be a danger in the future? This backstory is a fucking abomination. It's a complete contradiction of everything Luke stood for and was supposed to be.
The drinker talks about how Luke Skywalker was this legendary figure who saved both his father and the galaxy in an act of moral righteousness, and yes, that's true. But what is interesting about that is that The Last Jedi has a thematic element to it, where legends and large epic ideals are complicated by interpersonal or practical realities. This is the continuity between the Canto Bight sequence and Luke's backstory with Kylo, as well as Kylo's personal arc dealing with the fact that he killed his father and almost killed his mother in a quest to emulate Darth Vader. Again, the drinker is aggressively not getting the point. He is furthering nothing but his own ignorance in making this argument. Luke is tempted by the dark side and refuses, which the critical drinker calls pussying out for some weird reason. But young Ben Solo doesn't see that internal struggle. He only sees his master standing over him with a lightsaber, a betrayal he had been primed by Snoke to fear. Luke actually describes in the film how Snoke had already darkened Ben's heart, and in the previous film Leia outright states that it was Snoke that turned Ben into Kylo Ren. What we're getting here is a transformation of a grand narrative into something personal and complicated. It's a nice touch, reminiscent of elements like Anakin's experience with his mother's death in Attack of the Clones. The filmmakers are very directly showing us a through line between the individual lives of our characters in the Star Wars mythology, and this ties back thematically with the other elements of the film previously mentioned, but especially also the scene where Luke talks about how it was his status as a legendary figure that contributed to the situation. Where he failed Ben was as a mentor and uncle, someone who should have protected him. The drinker paints Luke's brief temptation towards a dark act as an inconsistency, but it isn't. In Legends, Luke actually killed a dark side user named Lumia, who had corrupted his nephew Jason, sort of a parallel to what the sequel trilogy shows, and Luke's killing of her in anger had, in his view, potentially tainted him with the dark side. The idea that Luke would do something dark when he was previously a character who had come out of his quest making the right decisions isn't a contradiction, it's human. The dark side's temptation isn't a one-and-done deal, where you say no and then you never feel that draw again. It's a representation of an element of the human psyche and spirituality, where calling on the dark side allows a user to gain control or feel they are gaining control over things outside their control, when ironically the discipline of the light side involves letting go of things outside one's control, like life and death. This is directly alluded to in the film when Luke trains Rey, where she describes the Force as being life, death that brings about new life, and an internal balance to it all. Luke and Rey then mention the place beneath the island, which Luke calls the darkness. The direct implication here is that the light side and dark side aren't life and death themselves, they're different views of or reactions to that balance. The darkness gives you what you want easily, when what you want is easy answers. The light is more difficult because it involves making harder decisions. Luke learns this in the original trilogy, and one can easily imagine that in this film his understanding of that is why he didn't kill Kylo Ren at any point. For him, that's the easy answer, and the darkness is always there tempting him with it. He rises above and we get to see that. The snag is that Ben got to see it too, and because he was in the darkness, his understanding of that power was not that it was something Luke could resist and thereby overpower, but that resisting it was a weakness. He tells Rey that Luke saw his power like Luke sees hers. And that's an interesting line when you think about where Kylo Ren is coming from. He sees the dark side as a key to greater power, and so naturally, he would see Luke in that scene not as being tempted to take an easier but unworthy path, but as being tempted by the same stronger power. Remember that earlier the drinker specifically called out how changes to characters or concepts in a series can subvert tired tropes. Remember also that he played up the idea that he felt that for a second there was a moment where he believed there would be an epic moment of Luke Skywalker seizing his destiny. What's interesting is that the drinker's expectations were subverted in a way that was pretty clever writing, but he couldn't see it because his response was to get angry at the fact that it even happened in the first place. Luke tossing his lightsaber is a great little moment for this exact reason, because it perfectly sets up his arc in the film. The drinker talks about what he imagined for a moment Luke might do, but when he did it, it was as though he thought Luke's arc would be over at the beginning of the film, which doesn't make much sense, because clearly Luke is meant to have some role here, and a nice bit of writing that would give him a dynamic presence in the film. But resolving his arc at the beginning would mean he doesn't have that dynamic presence and instead is just a powerhouse for the rest of the film. The only way to really subvert that would be to cut it short, either by crippling his powers or killing him off to serve Rey's arc, the way Obi-Wan and Yoda are killed off previously in the service of Luke's arc. Obi-Wan in A New Hope is a relatively static character who doesn't have much utility for the narrative of the film, after the Death Star escape sequence at least, so Lucas killed him off right as that happens. It's a nice little moment, but giving Luke something like that would hardly have been a safe move for Rian Johnson here in The Last Jedi. If anything, giving Luke an arc of personal growth makes a lot of sense if you want him to at least live until the final confrontation of the film before killing him off. And the best way to do that is to construct a reason why he's on Ahch-To, and construct a backstory for Kylo Ren, and construct a conflict between Luke and Rey and Kylo, all at the same time. It's an elegant little bit of writing that allows Luke's main conflict in the film to be internal, a reflection of the external conflict of the Resistance against the First Order, and the dueling element of Rey's personal arc. Calling this bad writing because it wasn't representative of a previous image of Luke Skywalker that you had in your head is self-centered, lazy, and bad art criticism. I hope this video has been instructive for some of you. More could be said about the rage review genre, but that will have to wait until next time. Like this video, comment to let me know your thoughts, subscribe for more, support me on Patreon, and I will see you then.